Greetings of peace, everyone. Salam alaikum to those who are Muslim. My name is Ishaq. I am the Bay Area Director at Islamic Networks Group, also known as ING. And I'd really like to welcome you to our virtual iftar, which is centered on the theme, reviving and maintaining spirituality while social distancing. As you may already know, our organization is a peacemaking one that's dedicated to face-to-face education and engagement to foster understanding of Muslims and other misunderstood groups to promote harmony among all people. And this iftar here is an extension of our Interfaith Speakers Bureau, or IFSB for short. What we'll plan to do this evening is we'll be hearing from ING speakers who represent each of the three Abrahamic religions, Islam, Christianity, and Judaism. We'll be engaging in small group discussions, and we'll be learning about breaking the fast in Islam. We'll end our event with the call to Muslim prayer, which signifies the time to break our fast, and then we'll close with interfaith prayers to carry us forward. So without further ado, we are going to get started with our panel for this evening. And our guests for the panel include Maha Al-Junaidi, who is the founder and executive director of Islamic Networks Group. And Maha, if you can just wave. Rabbi Amy Alberg, who is the director of Pardes Road of Shalom, Pursuer of Peace Community Program. And then Diane Frankel, who is an active member at All Saints Episcopal Church and the San Francisco Advisory, and is on the San Francisco Advisory Board of Facing History and Ourselves. And so thank you so much to all of our panelists for being here. And I'm going to switch to this. We'll start with Maha. So Maha, our first question of the evening is, what does spirituality mean to you?
That's a great question. I just want to make sure okay, great. That I'm unmuted. So spirituality for me is an experience of intimacy with God, not just closeness, but intimacy. So I use that word carefully. If I could put into words the experience, which is difficult, it is a moment in time in which I feel wide awake, fully self-aware, laser focused in my vision, very still and quiet, and also fully aware of my surrounding environment. And in that state, I feel God's presence and have deep insight into a situation or a problem I'm thinking about. It's a place where I'm able to see or understand things much more clearly than in normal times. And these moments may last only a few minutes, but it feels as if time expands in these moments. So they feel like they last longer than they probably are. I don't experience this too frequently, but I know that it's possible to experience it much more frequently if I make it a priority in my life, if I make the time for it, and if I have the intention to do it. And I usually experience these spiritual moments while I'm meditating on remembrances of God. In Arabic, it's called dhikr, which I love to do, or when I'm alone reading the Quran and reflecting on its meaning, or when I'm deeply focusing on my supplications to God, appealing to God for help, for healing in some way. And these moments for me are best achieved in the very early morning hours before dawn, which is essentially the middle of the night. So I do often get up between 3 and 4:30 to do special prayers, the Hajj prayers, and I'm up all the way up until sunrise. And that's the best time for me personally. Or I'll experience this at any time of the day when I'm in some form of intentional worship. Now, in the Muslim tradition, it's recommended that we pray in congregation, but actually for me, I'm someone who prefers to pray alone, to try to get into that state as much as possible. But I find it difficult to do in the canonical prayers that are required of Muslims, because there's a lot of recitation you have to do, there's a lot of physical movements in our prayers. However, it is possible to achieve it, that level of spirituality, even in the 5 canonical prayers, but I haven't developed that capacity for it yet. And I know this because about 2 decades ago, I'm going to share with you a story. I studied with a Muslim scholar, quite a prominent person in Berkeley, who was the head of his department. who literally spend an entire semester, 4 months, interpreting the 7 verses of the Fatiha, which is the opening chapter of the Quran. And this scholar, world-renowned, very well respected in the academy, so he really knows his stuff. And as one of his many signs of genius, while he was teaching us, he had several books open in front of him that he would reference, books in Persian, Turkish, Urdu, and Arabic by different interpreters. And he began the semester by reflecting on the first letter of the first word of Al-Fatiha. The first word is Bism. And so he begins his interpretation by actually just focusing on the first letter of the first word, which is Bih. So this is how deep this class went. And by the middle to the end of the semester, now knowing the meaning of what I was reciting, I couldn't pray because I couldn't do my canonical prayers because now I understood the meanings. The meanings were so deep that it would have taken me hours to finish just one cycle of the prayer as I reflected on each of the verses. So what I had to do in order to continue doing my 5 daily canonical prayers that Muslims are required to do is to intentionally set aside the meanings and focus just on the words. And that's when I realized that the prayers and the Quranic recitation are actually much more powerful in spiritual terms than I personally have the capacity for. Now, this was 20 years ago. I was much younger and maybe less spiritual than I am today. And it would be really interesting for me to go back and revisit that. But for the time being, I achieved spirituality, which I define as intimacy with God through other forms of worship that are much more accessible to me, which I described. Yeah.
Thank you, Maha. Thanks so much for sharing that. We'll now move on to Rabbi Amy.
So that was very, very beautiful to listen to, Maha. I come at this a little differently. Jewish tradition has a word for what you, Maha, were describing. The word is devekut, which comes from the same root as the modern Hebrew word for glue. Devekut is intimacy, really stuck togetherness with God, which is, an incredibly exalted, elevated state. For me, in my sense of it is that spirituality includes the seeking of that kind of state, the seeking of relationship with, of connection to, of receiving wisdom from the divine. And that sometimes I'm doing my spiritual life and doing my spiritual practices and nothing happens. Nothing profound happens. That's not because I'm doing it wrong, but that's part of the spiritual practice is the setting the table, is of increasing the likelihood that I'm preparing myself to be ready when those extraordinary moments of, for me, in my language, maybe revelation or intimacy were to come. So I want to read you definition of spirituality. There's a period in the Jewish world when 20, 30 years ago, suddenly everybody was talking about spirituality, and there was a certain critical voice in the community that said, what is this spirituality? Is this just the latest buzzword? What does it mean anyway? How do you say it in Hebrew? What does it mean anyway? So a bunch of people, scholars and rabbis, jumped in and said, okay, here's what I mean by spirituality. My teacher, Rabbi Arthur Green, who's a world-renowned scholar of Hasidism and also personally a spiritual seeker, define spirituality in this way: the striving for life in the presence of God and the fashioning of a life of holiness appropriate to such striving. I have a longer definition too, but it might be too long for you to take in. I'll read that again: the striving for life in the presence of God and the fashioning of a life of holiness appropriate to such striving. So the way I understand that, I don't like the word striving very much. I'm surprised he used it that way, but instead of, I would say maybe the seeking after, the expression of a desire for life lived in the presence of God. And not only that, but also the fashioning of a whole life that testifies to that striving. That is, if I pray my heart out, but I'm a mean and closed-fisted person, then that's not spirituality. That's hypocrisy. So it's the combination of the reaching for the feeling, the desire, the noticing the longing when I'm not as in touch as I might like to be, rejoicing when I do have those blessed moments of deep connection, and fashioning, preparing the table, structuring my life in such a way that there are many, many, many opportunities during the day when, even if I say canonical prayers that sometimes come out by rote, but sometimes lead me to a moment of deep connection, it was good that I learned to say them. And just to wrap up, I would say, maybe in more simple terms, spirituality is reaching up, assuming, and for me that's metaphoric, that God lives above. I don't actually believe that God lives above as opposed to below and around and within. God lives in every place, but since, to use the vertical metaphor, reaching up toward God, inward to contact and be inspired by the presence of the divine within me and all around me, and reaching out with deeds of kindness and charity and generosity of various kinds. Thanks.
Thank you, Rabbi Amy, for sharing that with us. Diane, we'll move on to you now. I'm unmuting you.
There
We
okay.
go.
Well, those were both beautiful words from Maha and Rabbi Amy. Maha talked about intimacy with God, and Rabbi Amy spoke about seeking God and setting the table. And I agree that those are very, very important parts of spirituality for me. To me, spirituality is about connecting with God. That is, listening for God and opening myself to God. So it's different than just attending services, reciting prayers, listening to a sermon. These practices engage the head and maybe also the heart through being in community. But spirituality to me is seeking to be in communion with God beyond head and heart to my very soul. Now, this connection is elusive. Practices may help, but there's no guarantee that we are going to have that special sense of connection that both Maha and Rabbi Amy talked about. It's so powerful when we do connect that the seeking is, the longing of our soul is part of our sense of ourselves as a people of faith. I might feel a spiritual connection at a worship service. Singing a beautiful hymn often brings me very suddenly close to God, and I may be in tears because of it. I may also feel God's presence when I'm passing the peace to members of our community, because I'm connecting with God that's within each of us. As Rabbi Amy says, God is everywhere, including within each of us. We have in the Christian faith a particular service called communion. It's the Mass or the Eucharist. It's sharing sanctified bread and wine, representing Christ's body and blood. And in our church, we celebrate that communion in the round. We come to an altar that is surrounding a central cross, and we kneel, and we can see each person who is actually receiving communion. That's very powerful. I'm a lay minister, and I offer the cup to our congregation, the sanctified wine. Seeing each person take the cup, I can greet Christ again and again, and that connects me to God and to our congregation in a very powerful way. And we describe these moments of connection as moments of grace in the Christian church. And we talk about God reaching out to us through the Holy Spirit. So those are words that we use in our faith to describe that moment of connection. But of course, spirituality is getting closer to God even without community around. My New Year's Eve resolution this year was to do more meditation, setting the table, as Rabbi Amy said. I'll talk a little bit about those practices a little later in the program, but I really do believe that God is waiting for us and happy to greet us. Thanks.
Thank you so much, Diane. That was beautiful. We're going to now move on to our second question, and we'll go back to Maha. And the second question is recognition of not only spirituality, but where we are right now, which is during a time where we are sheltering in place, where COVID-19 is kind of spread around the world and people are social distancing. And so the question is, how do you maintain your spirituality during a time of social distancing? Start with you, Maha.
Yeah, so I actually love social distancing and physical distancing as well, because I actually believe that both of them are, social and physical, are actually the prerequisites for me, for instilling spirituality as I've defined earlier, which is, for me, is intimacy with God. I'm not at a place where I can feel spiritual among people, just the opposite, in fact. And I'm talking about all the social events that I generally attend. They're either community events or private parties that I go to. They're not, their intention is not to sort of raise our spirituality. And I don't think I'd be very sociable in the normative sense if I was if I were deeply spiritual in that way. So in order for me to attain that level of spirituality, I would prefer either being completely alone or being with similarly spiritual people. Now, I've met people who are able to be deeply spiritual among people in a social setting, but it's always been in an environment of study or meditation. And they've usually been highly regarded shuyukh or Muslim teachers, Islamic professors. And you can tell that they're not all together here with us, because part of them is somewhere else at a spiritual level. And they tend to have an incredible aura about them, not charisma, but a very spiritual aura that can be described as a light around them, as well as stillness. And they seem almost motionless, even if they're moving. And everything that comes out of their mouth is pure wisdom and quite substantive. And these are not people that do small talk. So I've met people like that. I've met a lot of people like that through my teacher, one of my teachers, Hamza Yusuf. So personally, I find and maintain my spirituality during physical and social distancing, and so I'm fine. I could do this forever, I think. Yeah.
That's great. Thank you, Maha. And now, what about you, Rabbi Amy? Oh, you're muted. No, you. There we go.
Okay. So when I first heard the order about social distancing, one of my early thoughts, among many, many, many thoughts and feelings, one of them was the Jewish community is never going to do this. They're just not going to do this because many of us don't follow orders very well, but also the Jews on the call know what I mean. But because our spirituality is so communitarian, I thought, how are we going to do this? It's going to be real. And then it became clear that we needed to stop having worship services with a lot of people in them. And I thought, how are people going to be able to tolerate that? And now where Muslim friends are in the midst of Ramadan, we're already talking about what's going to happen during the high holidays in September and October. September, people are just dreading, how could we possibly do these holidays not in the presence of hundreds of people? But in terms of my daily life, a tiny bit like Maha, much of what I'm doing is the same as otherwise, except with heightened urgency and vibrancy. I meditate every morning alone in my home. I say liturgical prayers every morning. I say liturgical prayers many times during the day, and usually words of thanksgiving. I do mindfulness practices and loving kindness practices all through the day, and those don't require community. So as I say, those are not so different, except that they're in the context of need and constriction and sorrow and fear and all the emotions that we have in the midst of the pandemic. The holy days are a little harder. Shabbat and holidays like Passover that we just had, and we're about to have Shavuot, and we're starting to worry about the high holy days because those feel more intensely communal. But we've begun to do our services on Zoom, which at first felt very, very weird. And yet there's also a sense that we're hungry. I'm going to lead a service, so I would normally not use my computer on Shabbat, but I turn on my computer because of these times, and I see these faces that are beloved to me, and people are just reaching out to one another, and there's a sweetness and a loving energy about being so happy, reaching out for contact with one another as best we can. Back to that in just a moment. And then I do a lot of walking, as we all do in these times. I think during the walking, I'm either meditating or I'm listening to spiritual podcasts. So I'm trying to take in wisdom. I'm intentionally trying to reach out in kindness, even if it's just a second of the way I greet someone that I pass, and notice the kindness of the way they greet me. And sometimes I'm sort of sending blessings of well-being to all the homes that I pass. And I'm doing a ton, as a rabbi, I'm doing a ton of reaching out to teach and to counsel and to facilitate and to lead prayer. And I'm very much actively seeking ways to that I can to mitigate the suffering of communities who are more vulnerable and marginalized than my own community is. I regularly feel like I wish I could do more, but that's very much a part of my spiritual practice now too, is watching for every possible opportunity to stand in solidarity with people who have too often been invisible.
Sure.
But
yeah, thank you. Thank you so much, Rabbi Amy, for sharing. And then Diane, would you close us off with this question? How do you maintain spirituality in a time of social distancing? There we go.
Oh.
There we go.
Unmuted again. All right. I loved what Maha and can you hear me?
Yeah.
Oh, okay. It says I can't unmute myself, so I'm confused. I loved what Maha and Rabbi Amy had to say. I mentioned that I practice a particular type of meditation, a Christian meditation called centering prayer. And we're taught in that practice to empty our brain using one word to sweep away all thoughts and just wait silently for God and for God's presence. And this is a chance to clear away the world and acknowledge that there is a God. Since New Year's, I've actually been doing this centering prayer for practice for about 20 minutes most days. And it calms me. It allows me to understand that we are all part of God, all part of that one God. And coincidentally, this has been a great practice to use during this time of social distancing. It's been really more important these days. I think of it as visiting with God or waiting for God, like Jesus asked his disciples to do at the Garden of Gethsemane. We're also taught that God lives within each one of us. And I know that I can see God in others more clearly if I take some time each day to connect with the God within me. We've had the holiest days in our Christian calendar, Easter and the Easter holidays just recently. And this year we missed so much of the symbolism that moves one's soul at these special services. We have the washing of the feet, the celebration of the Last Supper, the veneration of the cross, the holy fire at the Easter Vigil, the Paschal candle. These visual and oral cues trigger deep remembering in all of us as Christians of Easter's past and of our path to God. And we had some connections to these things, as Rabbi Amy mentioned, through Zoom services. But to be honest, it's hard to feel that spiritual connection through Zoom. Still, I think the words are ancient and we know them well. And so we remember. In this time of need, being with community virtually, as Rabbi Amy said, is just so powerful. That alone helped me to feel that connection with God. So I think really what I've learned is that in this time of crisis, that God is with each of us, and it's just a matter of reaching out. Thanks.
Thank you so much, Diane, and thank you so much to all three of our panelists this evening for sharing a little bit about what spirituality means to you and how you're able to maintain it. We're now going to transition to small group discussions where you all will be discussing these same questions. So I'm going to ask Rahima to put the questions in the chat before everyone goes into the groups. We're going to pause the recording and we'll return to hear some takeaways from each small group now. So Zoom the recording. And I hope that all of your sessions were great. I know mine was.
Yeah, mine too.
Yeah, I really enjoyed that. Okay, so for the next 15 minutes or really 14 minutes, what we're going to do is just do a little bit of a share out by our facilitators. So I'm going to ask Esther, would you mind sharing for about 1 to 2 minutes some of the takeaways of your group with the rest of us, and I'll go ahead and unmute you.
Thank you. So our group had fun. There were only 4 of us. I don't know about the rest of you. So for spirituality, we had 2 themes, I'd say. The theme of finding our spirituality in nature and life and connecting with things full of life, whether that be family and friends or animals. I know at least one person, I saw her cat go by on the screen here tonight. And then there was also the idea of connecting with other people. And half of our members talked about finding renewed spirituality through the multi-faith activities of bringing all the Abrahamic faiths especially together. So that was our first question. And our second one, we started running out of time. At least one of us did Easter services with the Pope, which was kind of exciting. But some of us have been doing spiritual meditation on our own to get through these times. And some of us did Passover via Zoom Seders, where people were in their own houses with their own Seder plates, but reading together.
Oh.
Yep.
Is that all? Great. Thank you so much, Esther, for sharing. It sounds like you guys had a really rich discussion. Next, can we hear from Diane?
Yeah, so we also had 4 people in our group, and we also had a wonderful discussion. I think we talked about the duality of spirituality for both self and other. So with the idea of other being service to community, and the self being able to go within oneself and leveraging that strength to help, basically help with community. We talked about acts of service really being spiritual ways to express our spirituality, and almost that those acts of service transform us. The idea of mentoring on Zoom, helping students connect, helping our people that have economic difficulties get through the time. Those are acts of service that really make a meaning. And then, of course, nature. The idea of being out walking and seeing God's beautiful world. And we really talked about the tikkun olam, the Jewish concept of healing the world, and how that's coming to be such an important thing in these very trying times, and how can we help to support our communities. So those were ways in which we really talked about our spiritual connections.
Thank you so much, Diane. And now we'll hear from Bob. Up there. Hey, Bob.
Hi, now you can hear from me. So we had the perfect group. We had 3 people, and we had 1 Jew, 1 Christian, and 1 Muslim.
Oh, wow.
It was perfect. And we had a wonderful, rich discussion. We discovered that 2 of us lived very close, just on either side of the San Francisco Creek, and Diane and I probably walk past her house when we go that way. But I think there was a general agreement that spirituality for the 3 of us is principally an active verb. It has to do with how you live your life. And I thought it was wonderful that one of us pointed out that the way you live your life is in fact a form of worship. And trying to live in a way that is in keeping with what God expects of us. And certainly for me, it has to do with seeing God in every person and working with God to complete the creation, improve the world. As Diane said, she knows tikkun olam is essential to me. But at the same time, one of the people has an aspect of meditation, and I thought it was interesting. She has daily sort of quiet meditation, and also what I would call as active meditation while she's jogging through the beautiful springtime neighborhood. So for us, the commonality of the 3 faiths was the one thing that stood out for me.
Thank you so much for sharing, Bob. Rabbi Amy, would you mind telling us a little about what your group talked about? There you go.
Okay. Yeah, I was so entranced by the conversation, I forgot to take notes, but I'll try to get some highlights. It was a wonderful, wonderful group of people, wonderful conversation. 2 of us in the group are meditators, and so there was some talk about that that inward exploration as being a key part of exploring connection to the source. And there was some talk about study of an immersion in various different wisdom traditions, and finding, as someone had said before, that although there's some differences among the traditions, at core there are also many similarities. So that was very very moving to hear that named, and also some talk about how spiritual life is all of life, not just what's done in the mosque and the synagogue and the church or on the cushion, but the way we live all of our lives, the way we carry ourselves, and talking to God at any time through those moments of our lives.
Thank you, Rabbi Amy. And next we'll go with Amina from ING. There we go.
A large group of diverse participants from different faiths, Judaism, Christianity, and Buddhism, but we were all women, so we weren't very diverse in terms of gender. And we had a lot of varied comments. There was not a lot of similarities, so I'll try to summarize some of them. It was a great discussion. Unfortunately, we did run out of time, so I didn't get to the second question as much as we would have liked to. So one of the ways is true spirituality is to connect to the greater whole through prayer, through gratitude, through meditation, and also through seeing the world with a big heart and eyes. And as people have said before, that it's a journey. Other people commented about how it's really being in the presence of God and seeing God in others and practicing ways to cultivate the spirituality. One of our group members was very honest in talking about how hard it was to feel spiritual these days and have a spiritual life, just because of the way that our world is today. And then the idea that it means a profound sense of belonging as well as connection, or a sense that I am in a place where I'm supposed to be. And of course, practice can help to lead to that. And then lastly, while not all faith traditions center around a divine being, there's a different way of approaching the same journey, which is through connection and through kindness. So we mainly focus on the first question. We talked briefly about the second question, and the shared points were that both Easter and the Seder being shared at home, but one of the high points was sharing, again, via Zoom with family members across the country, which was something that was very special.
Thanks so much for sharing, Amina. And Maha.
Yeah, so I had with me Eileen Altman and Lori Hogan, and I realized that I actually met Lori many years ago, so I knew her. Both of them are Christian, and so their response was, I think, quite similar in where they find spirituality. They find it in seeking the inner voice of God, seeing God in every human being, the awareness of the presence of God, seeing God in the natural world, and communal practice is as important. At least that's what I gathered. Communal practice is as important as the practice that happens privately. Through prayers, through readings and reflections, and also things. Spirituality can also be found in your day-to-day actions. I asked both of them, this was off script, if they can tell me a significant spiritual experience in their life. And it was really interesting because I shared this with them. Both of them and myself found God in a situation of brokenness where we were in a state of despair, and we were basically on our knees pleading for God's help. And we were just getting now into the ethics and to try to dig deeper into that idea. And of course we didn't have enough time, but I really want to explore that idea. Is finding God in brokenness.
Sure. It'd be another iftar.
Another iftar, yeah.
Okay, and for our group, we had 4 participants we had 4 videos on screen, but we had 6 because 2 were couples. So that was really nice. And I think a major theme within our understanding of spirituality was connection. And then that connection was to the source of life and displaying gratitude, as well as to others and other people, and finally to nature. And being able to kind of see the way in which the animals in the animal kingdom operate with one another and feeling a sense of awe. I think that was a major feeling that was tied to what spirituality entails, awe, if we can kind of visualize that or think of that. And when that gets shifted with what we're doing with sheltering in place, it's kind of interesting because parts of our ability to connect are limited and other parts are expanded upon. So multiple people on the call did mention, or in the group did mention the idea of services being a little bit less spiritual, but they also mentioned how, because they're online, those who are part of their houses of worship or churches who have moved away can now join. And so this has really offered us an ability we can't connect in person, but we are reconnecting with a lot of people that we are not in touch with on that daily basis because they're not in our physical space. And I think that was really great. Another quote that someone mentioned, which I think is really interesting, was the building is closed, but the church is open. And you can really kind of translate that to any house of worship. in a recognition that, you know, spirituality and religion, it's not tied by physical spaces, it's tied by something more. And so being able to connect with these things, even in a virtual or non-physical space, is something that's really, really present. And then the last thing was also just being able to connect with others in ways through movie nights and things like that. And so I want to thank all of you so much for your participation on the breakout groups. I wish they were a little bit longer, but we are limited by time. And so we are going to move forward to our last portion of the evening, at which point Rahima Ramazani, who has been here, who's been the one kind of monitoring the entire IT, which has been great. Thank you so much, Rahima. And I will be talking a little bit about the breaking of the fast from both Sunni and Shia perspectives. And at the end of our explanation, Imam Amar Billah, who just joined, will deliver the Muslim call to prayer, which will signify that it is time to break fast. And so just to kind of iterate, within the Sunni tradition, Muslims will break fast at the beginning of sunset. And today, sunset is in 4 minutes at 8:04. And what is common is Muslims will traditionally break the fast with a few dates and water. So if you might have seen in my email, I mentioned that. And I mentioned that hopefully everyone next to them has some sort of fruit and date that they can, if you don't have a date, then some sort of fruit or some sort of water that you can use to break your fast. And I see that you're all showing me, which is really great. And and then beyond that, there's other, depending on the culture, Muslims, there's 1.8 billion Muslims around the world, and they exist within every culture. And so there's other light foods that could be soup or fried foods in some cuisines, and other appetizers, and just nuts and other fruit. And one thing that's important is that before breaking the fast, they will recite a prayer, and it translates to, "O God, for you I have fasted, and with your provision I have broken the fast," which is really something that affirms that the fast was for God, and it also recognizes an appreciation for the sustenance that God provides. So Muslims are fasting for God, but then they're also eating for God, and in both that way, and God is involved in all aspects of one's life. I'm now going to ask Rahima to unmute yourself and tell us a little bit about the tradition of breaking the fast in the Shia tradition.
Awesome, thank you, Ishaq. I'm glad I get to participate too as part of the iftar. As Ishaq mentioned, there are slight differences between the Shia and Sunni Muslims and how they break their fast. So just to give you a little context, Shia Muslims are followers of a branch of Islam that believe that the Prophet Muhammad, peace be upon him, was succeeded by his son-in-law, Ali ibn Abi Talib, and his descendants, and have some differences in practice from their Sunni brothers and sisters. One difference, as this is the context of today, is in the timing of when they break their fast during Ramadan, which is tied to the difference in the time to perform the evening prayer, which takes place, as Ishaq said, at sunset. The difference is derived in the understanding of what is meant by sunset. Most Shia Muslims will wait until the last rays of the sun are fading from the sky to break their fast, which is usually about 12 to 15 minutes after the time Sunni Muslims will break their fast. So as you will see, most of the Muslims on this call will be breaking their fast, as Ishaq said, I think maybe 2 minutes now. I'll have to wait a little bit longer, but just a little bit of differences like intra-faith information.
Great, thank you, Rahima. I'm now going to, we have 1 minute, and so I'm going to just ask Kari Amar Billah to deliver the call to prayer at 8:04. And until then, so if you want to unmute yourself, Kari, or Imam Billah, and until then, I will just ask everyone, what Muslims will commonly do is they'll kind of have a silent meditation or prayer before the fast. And so we'll just kind of sit in silence, and then he will open up the fast by delivering the call to prayer. So just make sure that he's unmuted and go from there. Oh, there, you are unmuted. Great.
Okay, I was trying. Assalamu alaikum. Hi, everyone.
Hello.
Hello, Kari.
Thank you so much for being here.
Good to see all of you. My name is Kari Amr. I'm going to be standing up. Usually when we call adhan, I'm going to stand up and call adhan.
Okay.
If you don't mind. أكبر الله أكبر الله أكبر الله أكبر أشهد أن لا إله إلا الله أشهد أن لا إله إلا الله أشهد أن محمدا رسول الله أشهد أن محمدا رسول الله حي على الصلاة حي على الصلاة حي على الفلاح حي على الفلاح الله أكبر الله أكبر لا إله إلا الله لا إله إلا الله اللهم رب هذه الدعوة التامة والصلاة القائمة آت سيدنا محمدا الوسيلة والفضيلة وابعثه اللهم مقاما محمودا الذي وعدته إنك لا تخلف الميعاد اللهم تقبل صلاتنا وصيامنا يا أرحم الراحمين يا رب العالمين آمين آمين جزاكم الله خير.
Thank you so much, Imam Amar, for delivering that for us. That was really beautiful to hear. Just to translate the call to prayer, it reads, God is great, and that is repeated 4 times. It then reads, I bear witness that there is none worthy of worship except God, and that I bear witness that Muhammad is the messenger of God. And then it says twice, come to prayer, and then it says, come to success, and then reiterates, God is great. There is no God but God. Mm-hmm. And that is the call to prayer that Muslims use throughout before their prayers. And at this point, most of the people on the call who are Sunni at least have now broken their fast. And so thank you all. And we are going to end our evening with a few closing prayers. So I'm going to ask Diane Frankel first to offer us a brief closing prayer from the Christian tradition.
So, loving God, you have filled all creation with your blessing. You call us all to fullness of life. Thank you for this gathering. Comforter of the afflicted, healer of the brokenhearted, bring peace and health to those who mourn or who are suffering in body, mind, or spirit, and strengthen our hearts to love and serve you and all the people we meet along the way. Amen.
Thank you so much, Diane. Rabbi Amy, would you mind leading us in prayer from the Jewish tradition?
Okay. I'm just going to pray from my heart. I think not so much from the tradition. I ask God, the source of all life, to send divine healing to all those who are ill, to all those who are grieving, to all those who are frightened and lonely, all those who are touched by the virus. I ask God to send wisdom to political leaders, public health officials, and to scientists, all hoping that modes of treatment and prevention will soon be found. I ask God to fill us with strength, collectively fill us with wisdom to learn what there is to learn from this experience, so that when we do go back to more normal life after the virus, that we won't go back to the world of injustice and disparities that existed before, but that the time after the time of the virus will be a time of a transformed world. Amen.
Thank you, Rabbi Amy. And we'll conclude our closing prayers with Maha from ING.
Is my mic off?
It's on.
It's on. Okay. Okay. Bismillah ar-Rahman ar-Rahim. In the name of God, the compassionate, the merciful. Ya Allah, dear God, please bless us all who gather together this evening to share about our different paths to spirituality. Please enable us to support each other during these challenging times. Ya Allah, dear God, we thank you for all the blessings that you have showered upon us and which we often forget to be grateful for. Ya Allah, dear God, please extend those blessings to those who do not share our bounties, provide food for the hungry and shelter for the homeless. Ya Allah, dear God, help us to work together as a nation to a solution and end to this pandemic that is wise and fair. And I'll end with Surah Al-Asr. Bismillah ar-Rahman ar-Rahim. Wal-Asr inna al-insana lafi khusr illa alladhina amanu wa amilu salihat wa tawasaw bil-haqq wa tawasaw bis-sabr. In the name of God, the compassionate, the merciful, by the token of time through the ages, verily human beings are in a loss, except those who have faith and do righteous deeds and join together in the mutual teaching of truth and of patience and constancy. Ameen.
Amen.
Thank you so much, Maha. And you're an echo. Thank you, Maha, and thank you everyone for being here. I want to wrap up by thanking our panelists, thanking our facilitators, Farhima from ING who managed all of the tech, and to you all for spending your evening with us. If you did enjoy today's iftar, then you can also join us for another iftar next week, which is on Thursday, May 14th from 7:15 to 8:30. And the link to register, the theme for that next week's meeting is in relation to Mother's Day. And we'll be discussing and celebrating motherhood in religious traditions. And I'm going to post the link here in the chat, so you can feel free to click it and sign up. This is basically the end. It is now almost 8:15. And so at this point, those who are Muslim can go on to perform the evening prayer and then have dinner. I also know that some of you wrote in that you ordered special takeout for this food, so you can also enjoy your iftar. And before we end, though, I do want to recognize that it is Maha's birthday today.
No!
And so everyone could just give her a happy birthday. We won't sing for you because I think unison sing will sound not great. But,
that's very sweet. Thank you. Thank you so much, Ishaq. And thank you for all the good work that you're doing.
Sure. Yeah. So so thank you again, everyone, and have a wonderful evening.
Thank you.